So welcome to part two of our discussion. This will be a separate video where we will be discussing Whiplash. Again, all spoilers. I'll explain the plot this time. It follows this kid called Andrew, and he's an obsessive lover of jazz. And he's like studying jazz in like this like music school, and then for a series of events, he enters the class of Terence Fletcher, who turns out to be maybe the worst kind of teacher. He's abusive. He's aggressive, he's mean, and as a result, he ends up affecting Andrew's life in a negative sense. But he also ends up getting Andrew to become way more determined about like becoming one of the great musicians, maybe. And from there, it just gets like crazier and crazier. And yeah, this is like the third episode so far. This is the first time that we've discussed a film that I would put among my favorites of all time. And that's for a lot of reasons, but I would consider it to be like not only one of my favorite films, but one of the best films I've ever seen, easily.
Yeah, I think it's an absolutely fantastic film. It's really well constructed. Structurally, it's cast well. The visual style is really fantastic. I think it's one of the most wonderful films about obsession, and it's very believable as well. And I think that's kind of what's scary about it.
It's about that. It's also about like determination and desire. I think the thing that makes it quite relatable for me, and maybe even you, and probably anybody who's like around the age of the Andrew character, is that I think that anybody can identify with like, you know, having a passion for something, and wanting to work in a field that revolves around that passion, and sometimes being in situations where you feel like you and only you and a few other people really understand how much you love that thing that you love.
I do get that. I mean, that overwhelming desire to be a part of something that you really want to give your life over to. It's a very consuming passion, especially when you don't know quite how to develop sometimes and things like that. It does really consume the mind. I think films like Whiplash are brilliant. I think they're warnings actually against that kind of obsession.
I don't think that there's ever a scene that shows it in a purely positive light, but I do think that even the negative ones do have this slight twinge of possible positivity that prevent the film from feeling like it's essentially saying, if you do have a passion for, like, you know, jazz music, or if you want to be a jazz musician or something like that, it's not necessarily saying don't do that.
What I think it is saying is be careful about the way that you do pursue it, because it's one of those things that can screw you up if you do it if you don't approach it the right way. And I think what it showed was sometimes that absolute obsession with success doesn't always lead to it.
And I think we should like also go right ahead to like the ending of the film as well.
Yeah.
Because what's very notable to me is that the ending does not give a definitive answer one way or another, but it does very heavily give the suggestion that in his pursuit towards becoming the most talented, like, you know, jazz drummer that he can be, that Andrew is basically lost, you know, that he's like that he's like destroyed any connections, that any like familial or, you know, girlfriend connections that he has. He's kind of lost. He's even lost his like individuality, and that now he's just become this like drumming tool. You know, this kind of tool that is very good, but only exists to serve Fletcher. You know.
Yeah.
Even though Andrew is trying to defeat Fletcher at the end, it feels like he's completely become this thing that kind of pleases Fletcher either way. If he is genuinely great, then Fletcher will think that he's succeeded, and if he isn't, then Fletcher will think that he's won in his attempt at like humiliating Andrew.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting relationship, because I think the way that they set up the film is obviously Fletcher's is always in this position of power over Neiman, and while there's obviously it doesn't go so great for Fletcher, or it doesn't seem to go so great for Fletcher at the end when Neiman kind of does his own thing. That can almost also be seen as a win for him, because he was responsible for a lot of his musical education. You kind of see that moment, and you know that Fletcher can't really lose with Neiman. That I think the story becomes, it can only end either in tragedy or in a bittersweet way. You don't get so much that joyful ending because it's impossible, because the antagonist cannot lose.
It's a bit like the classical underdog story as well, a very like dark version of it, because the underdog story is always, the downtrodden person does really well in a position in a thing that they love, and then they become famous or something, like, like Rocky, any like sports film, anything like that. It's always they start low and then they end big. And this film has a similar structure, but the difference is that like the ending big might be the point where he loses, rather than wins.
So I think ambiguity really helps the film because, at the end, I mean, not that the film needs too much help to be fair, but I think it really helps the kind of tone sets up, because that, it leaves it up to the viewer to decide whether it was worth it. And I think that's quite nice. I think, for some viewers, I think it would, they'd be like, yeah, it's absolutely worth it. And then for others, I think it would be a much less clear-cut answer on that. And I think one thing that really grounds it is the two central performances from Miles Teller and J.K. Simmons, especially because this is probably one of the best performances I've ever seen from him.
Well, from both of them, yeah. I think
Both
this is the best acting that Miles Teller has done.
Yeah, no, I'd agree, no, I would agree with that completely. I think the way that they both, they kind of have these moments of explosive energy, but they've also got this constant obsessive drive, both of them, to succeed at what they do. Fletcher as a teacher trying to find the next Charlie Parker, and then Neiman with his obsession with becoming the best drummer he can. It just creates this sense, because there's so much tension and aggression in their interaction, the way they interplay, and then it's complemented obviously by the really tight framing quite a lot when they're talking, as close as they get, and it all inching in closer and closer and closer as it gets more and more to the boiling point, if you like. I think that really, really helps to make it work. Every conversation just feels so tense and pretend and big and important, and then it just propels the film further and further and further. It never lets up, so you never really lose that like feeling in your stomach of things just going wrong. And I think that's one thing I love about the film, because it holds you there, it keeps you there for near enough 2 hours without that effect wearing off. And I think that's a really rare thing for a film to be able to do. In a way, it's almost like a psychological horror film. That's, because it evokes this feeling of dread, tension, and fear. It is more a drama, but I would actually categorize it as a sneak horror film.
I'd say it's more like a yeah, horror in a like very grounded sense, but also like a thriller as well. Like if anything, it turns the like kind of jazz performances or even these like verbal sparring matches into like the equivalent of action sequences.
The build up to them, to me, feels like a horror sequence, and then when it's going, it does feel like an action sequence. It's quite, and it just really does add to this highly energetic, threatening, frightening kind of mode that ironically is quite the opposite tone of what jazz is meant to be like. I think Damien Chazelle does a great job directing the film.
It's a great marriage between, direction, writing, and acting. Like music, it's like, a rhythm, and if any of those things kind of didn't work, then the entire thing wouldn't work, But all of the individual elements are really great, and they all work very well together. So to like zoom in on the acting a little bit, J.K. Simmons has played a lot of these like angry guys before, but this is the first time where his character, like this wasn't like when he played like J. Jonah Jameson, where he was really funny. I mean, he's funny in this film and in some instances, but overall, like he's
a terrifying bully in this film. That's what
I know,
is.
absolutely. And to be honest, like the energy that he channeled, I think the other thing that makes this film kind of relatable as well is that he's kind of like that teacher that, on the one hand, would make class a lot more exciting, but also the kind of teacher that you really, really would not want to be taught by. And I think, and because like I saw this film when I was still in high school, so therefore I was like, when I was in class, I was thinking to myself, what if a teacher like Fletcher was here, instead of whoever was there, and I had this thing about, on the one hand, I was thinking to myself, like, it'd be really funny if like Fletcher was here and he was just like roasting all these like students or whatever, these students who aren't paying attention. But on the other hand, I was thinking to myself like, oh god, if I was in that environment, I wouldn't be able to function.
I mean, I've got no idea whether I'd be able to function or not in that situation. I think that's things like you just know it's not a comfortable environment. And I love those sequences when the drumming's going and he's drumming till he bleeds and he just keeps going. It just feels wrong to watch, and you just see him keep destroying himself, and I think it's just one of the most fascinating parts about that film. And I think when you look at that and you look at Neiman's home life and you see that it's pretty stable, but his dad just worked a dead end job that he didn't really do something he loved, and you just see Andrew's complete hatred of that. And I think you see him pushing himself, pushing himself, and pushing himself well beyond his limits to avoid that kind of fate. And I think that's really quite a fascinating thing to watch happen.
His father and Fletcher are kind of foils for each other, you know. Andrew's father is very loving, but he's also very, very unambitious, whereas Fletcher is the opposite of loving, but he's very ambitious, you know. So therefore you have these two kind of contrasting foils, and it really comes to a head at the end when Andrew's father comes in, and he kind of like he has that moment with Andrew where you think to yourself like, oh my god, like finally he's gonna get Andrew to come away and he's just gonna walk away from Fletcher, but like then Andrew has to run back because despite being set up in that final performance to fail, he's thinking to himself, no, I'm not gonna let him beat me, you know. But then obviously that might be him solidifying his own downfall, you know, we don't know.
I think the editing in this film is phenomenal.
Yeah, it does add to the tension. It also kind of makes that quick cut kind of editing technique work. And the reason why it works is because it's always very like specific, and it takes sequences where people are just kind of sitting down or standing. It kind of gives their actions more weight, and it kind of makes it feel like there's more movement.
Yeah, and it brings in all those little details as well. And I love how it just gets faster and faster as the pressure mounts and relationships change, and it really keeps the film on an emotional level feel very, very dynamic and constantly shifting, and you can't quite get your bearings. That just leads to a really, really effective experience overall.
And it also just makes the film feel like very like tight as well. Like it doesn't feel like there's a wasted sequence in the film. It feels like every scene has a purpose, you know, even these like small little brief moments. Like one bit that stuck out to me was just this random bit where you see it's before Andrew goes to like the bar to meet Fletcher or to run into Fletcher. It's where he's just walking, and you just see this bit where you just see like a street drummer performing, and that's like a little moment that obviously you could cut. But to me, it kind of adds to the fact that like no matter what, he just can't escape it. You know, he can't escape his passion.
That was just a very, very effective cut because it kind of showed it was, you know, the way he chosen to live his life and how he's done it. He is constantly, constantly immersed in it, and even when he's taking a break, even when he has to take time out for his mental health and gets it just isn't in the school anymore.
One bit that especially like stood out to me as well was the date scene that he has with his girlfriend.
Oh, yeah.
Because in that sequence, it's very like realistic because like all he wants to talk about is like the music that they're playing, and then his persona is clashing with like you know his girlfriend Nicole's persona because she's saying to him like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna you know pick any major that I feel like you know, and she's saying like, I just picked this university because they just made a good offer. And you can kind of tell that he is trying to be on her level. Like he does, like when she mentions feeling homesick.
Yeah, but you can also tell that he judges her for not having the same ambition that he does, or at least not having the clear sense of what her ambition is. You can just tell that he thinks he's better than her.
I know, and that's the interesting thing about Andrew's character is that, like, on some level, like, despite how much he suffers, you could kind of argue that he's not a particularly good person. He's not a particularly nice person.
No, he's not. I mean, his response to being in the car wreck, which was another brilliantly edited sequence, just because one, you know, it had a couple frames of black, and that was just really quite effective because just led tension there in the way that they did that. But I think what really spoke out to me about the sequence is he didn't stop to see how anyone else was when they was injured, didn't do any of the insurance things you're meant to, you know, like take insurance. He just kept going for his performance, and he pretty much tried to bully the other drummer off and was just screaming and yelling all the whole time. Just I think, especially in the situation that he was in, though the passion is understandable, that was just truly, truly wrong. And he was
Yeah.
driving really dangerously, which is why the accident happened anyway. He just didn't care.
So I don't necessarily agree in that bit, because in that bit I can kind of think to myself like adrenaline and stress was just taking over and he just wasn't thinking clearly. But there are other scenes beforehand where I agree he was acting like very unsympathetically, like in a few of the interactions that he had with like fellow classmates, or even the bit where I think the best example of that is probably the bit where he breaks up with his girlfriend, where he just he doesn't, like, he thinks that he's being reasonable and like honest, but in reality he's just like being really brutal about it. But despite that, there are scenes where you can kind of see his point, even if he's not being that nice about it. Like the biggest example would be that dinner table scene, which like every line in that scene feels like has a purpose, and that purpose is pointing out just that his family just doesn't like see eye to eye with him, and they do on occasion bring up good points against him, but for the most part he is being very, very like kind of, I wouldn't say snobbish, but he's being very like, oh, like all of you people are so ambitious and I'm so much better,
Yeah, exactly. And he's kind of there like, you guys are just dreamers, but I'm the next one. I'm the guy, when really he's just as much of a dreamer as everyone else is. I think that's quite fascinating, just how much of a hypocrite he is about the film, because while he does put in the practice and the time, he's kind of very, very self-absorbed, like,
hmm
extremely self-absorbed character.
But I do think that part of that, especially because the film starts when him and Fletcher meet each other, so you have no clue how Andrew was previously. Because of that, you can always kind of tell that Fletcher is kind of influencing him, that Fletcher
Yeah,
is kind of bringing out that behavior in him. And it's a good point as well about, because Andrew again is very, I do see him as very much like an abuse victim. I think that it's kind of truthful about like victims of abuse, that oftentimes as a result of that abuse, they can sometimes, like their attitude and their mind can be shifted negatively. So as a result, Andrew is way more like weirdly enough, a bit of Fletcher kind of starts rubbing off on Andrew.
yeah, no, it does. He definitely takes some of that harshness and that cruelty and kind of
hmm
injects it into his own life, and you kind of see that just slowly, that the good, the kind of the good natured passion gets destroyed in him, and it's
hmm
kind of, I think that's what erodes his relationships as well. It's not that it's just passion. He's passionate to the point that he doesn't care about anyone or anything else, and
hmm
I think that it kind of talks to the dangers of just single minded, actually particularly evil thoughts in the human psyche. I think, which is just really, really
Yeah,
interesting.
and the thing about the Fletch character as well is that there's a lot to interpret about him, because obviously you can't in any way interpret him as a good guy. But what is just up for interpretation is how bad he is. Like you can see him as like having seemingly good intentions, but way that you can view him, and that's just as being basically just a completely heartless, evil person who just wants to ruin people's lives, and he's just found a way of doing it, and he's found a way
I
of doing it, and he picks on younger people as well so that he can do it.
I see him as a heartless, selfish bastard, because
Yeah.
I think his dream, his goal of finding the next Charlie Parker has got
hmm
nothing to do with actually fostering a musical talent, as opposed to securing his name in musical history. When
Yeah.
I think the irony of that is he's already one of the most well-respected conductors and
hmm
people in the country, and that
hmm
alone, and he's in the most prestigious music school in New York, and it still
hmm
isn't enough for him.
I know, yeah, and he's abusing the power that he does have, especially like as a teacher, and as somebody who knows enough about jazz to be able to notice like the tiniest mistakes.
I think especially in the scene in the bar after he's been fired and Neiman sees him again, I think what's fascinating is that he doesn't regret any of his actions. He just
hmm
doesn't like the fact he got fired and just blamed everyone else, despite
I
the fact that
know.
it was his abusive nature and conduct that got him kicked out in the first place. I think it's really
hmm
telling for the kind of mindset that he is in.
He also doesn't seem to regret the fact that he basically caused one of his students to kill themselves. He even to his class, he even lied about it and seemingly pretended to feel bad about it. I think that like in that scene, in the bit where he goes into the class and he plays that music and then he talks about Sean Casey, a former student of his, if he does feel in any way sad, I think he just feels bad about the fact that he lost a potential, again, Charlie Parker.
Yeah, rather than the kid he actually had in front of him in his life got wrecked.
Because like if he did actually regret, if he regretted what he did, then that probably would have been a sign for him to like change his ways. But he doesn't change his ways, so therefore how he's emoting in that sequence, it can't be entirely true. And again, he also lied about the way that this kid died as well, in order to take the blame off of him.
I think, that was it. He was obsessed with his own image and his own thing above any love for music that he may have had or above any goals that he had. Everything was to do with his own image. I think, that professional vanity is kind of part of the obsession as well. I feel like he was once a Neiman kind of type,
Mhm.
and he just obsessed and obsessed and obsessed and became this abusive shell of a person.
And there's a deleted scene as well on the DVD that I watched, and it's the only I can see why it was cut, because it's the only scene that doesn't have Andrew in it. It's a scene of just like Fletchy's at home and he's like listening to this like this like jazz record or something, and he's kind of listening to it almost in like euphoria, like he's just kind of giving this like this kind of this he's looking up at the ceiling and it looks like he's absolutely in love with it. And it's interesting that that scene got cut, because it does expand on what you're saying to some degree. It's almost like he's so in love with what would you call it, like he's kind of like Andrew in that he's clearly a jazz fanboy, and he, like Andrew, is obsessed with it, even outside of work, or even outside of like teaching, outside of this music academy environment.
I think it's very much about musicians, and their all-consuming passion that some of them get. And I think in that way, Andrew and Fletcher are the same person, and I think it kind of perpetuates a cycle of that same kind of bullshit. I quite like the color of the film as well. It's very muddy, and in terms of the palette, it's browns and yellows are the primary kind of thing they use. And it
Yeah,
just
it's true.
this kind of dingy, nasty effect that just really complements that uncomfortable tone and that really brutal kind of repartee between the characters.
It's interesting that they were able to do that without making it look ugly. Like, it didn't look ugly, but they still managed to put in, as you said, a very like unpleasant color scheme.
No, exactly. It was a very visually effective film without being a beautiful film. Like, it was really, really well shot, and it was very, very well crafted. But I don't think you can call it beautiful as such.
No, not like like Damien Chazelle's next film, La La Land, which did look really, really gorgeous. It was kind of in that like in between. It was. I agree. Yeah, I never noticed that before actually, but that's a very good point. We haven't really touched upon all of the scenes where Fletcher is being like horrifically abusive to all of these like students, because what really stuck out to me is, again, in that sequence, like you do feel like you're there and you do feel like you're one of them, because either you feel like you're being yelled at, or you feel like you're one of the students who's just like hanging down their head like, oh god, we can't stop this. Again, because of Simmons's brilliant performance, he's able to like project himself to be it's almost like he's doing theater or something, because he just projects himself to be like so much bigger, not only than the set but than the film itself. He's able to make himself really big, and he's able to make himself so big that, again, it reaches you and it makes you think to yourself, this guy is in the room with me.
You feel like he's right next to you, especially when you've got a good surround sound system. But I think it adds to that feeling of pressure that the film creates and that ability to empathize with Andrew. And I think that's what stops you hating Andrew completely. So
Yeah,
I think he's a very hateable character.
I think hateable is a bit of a strong word, but unlikable. Yeah.
I think it's kind of what keeps you on Andrew's side is that Fletcher is so much worse.
I do think the thing that does like slightly make it a bit more watchable is that it's like kind of like in Full Metal Jacket. You have the drill sergeant. The thing that's similar about him, Fletcher, and them is that although they're scary, they're also really funny as well. And Fletcher does have like some of these like insults that are just so insane that they're funny, that you do kind of laugh. And also kind of internet culture has kind of made a lot out of these like kind of very like shouty, sweary people. So anybody who's had any experience with that will naturally like kind of find some of his insults to be funny instead of like threatening. But again, what's kind of good is that it does ride that line between like humor and threat. You know, like it's like neither one of them ever like kind of fully outweighs the other. It's always balanced.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
The film kind of leaves it ambiguous how it concludes. What I think and what I have noticed about this film is that there are some people who have read it as a standard underdog story, as a standard story about, you know, a person who triumphs against the odds or whatever. Either that, or I've noticed some people like thinking that Fletcher is like a good guy or something, or thinking that Fletcher is kind of justifiable in his behavior. What's very notable to me is that I don't think that either of those opinions would exist if the film had continued beyond where it just cuts off, because it ends very abruptly. It just cuts right as the climax comes. I don't think that either of those two opinions would exist if the film had continued and then maybe given us some kind of an epilogue that shows like Andrew's funeral or something like 10 years later, or I don't know, a scene afterwards where Andrew's thinking to himself like, oh my god, I've ruined myself, or even a bit of Fletcher saying like, no, I still beat you, or something like that, like any kind of an epilogue. I do think that if there was anything like that, you'd be forced to think to yourself like, oh my god, no, this is kind of like he has ruined himself, or he did end up ruining himself. But at the
Yeah,
same time, I do kind of like the fact that there isn't a definitive answer, because the fact that there isn't, then kind of as a result, it kind of prevents the film from feeling too like ham-fisted, or too much like it's a very like unsubtle, unnuanced message about the subjects that it's talking about, because by not showing an outcome, it then means that you can kind of draw any conclusion about what the film is saying that you want.
yeah, it really does push that ambiguity at the end. It really just commits to its tone and stays there. It doesn't give you anything easy or simple to deal with, and I think that's just part of what makes it absolutely fantastic in the
Yeah, I'm
ending.
not normally a fan of whenever films don't include an epilogue, because, you know, whilst obviously there are exceptions, for the most part, I kind of like it whenever a film like has the climax and then has like a resolution.
Yeah,
But in this case, I thought it was very, and it kind of also made like it just cuts to black and then the credits just immediately start rolling. I feel like that kind of then added like it went perfectly with that feeling of tension, because it's like you had tension all throughout, and then all of a sudden you had this sudden release. It's like you're stopping running or something like that. It's like it stops and you just go like like you're just out of breath.
it leaves you with that uncertainty. It leaves you with its impact, and it just stays there. I think it just shows the confidence of a great film to have an
Hmm.
ending like that.
I agree. Yeah, yeah, okay, yeah. So yeah, overall, yeah, I love it. Would highly recommend it. If you haven't seen it, definitely watch it. So in the next episode, we'll just be talking about one film instead of two films. So it will just be one episode. In that episode, me and Jack will be discussing Sin City: A Dame to Kill For. Just to go with the previous discussion that we had on Sin City. So yeah, that will be uploaded soon, or it will be recorded and uploaded soon.
Okay, thank you very much for listening, guys.